Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer-artist Thom Zahler. Thom, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thom, you are known for a number of interesting non-superheroic books, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started in comics.
So I went to the Kubert School in New Jersey, and when I graduated, I was doing other artwork like caricature and graphic design, things like that, and freelancing all the way through. So I did a lot of lettering, I did some inking, a little bit of coloring, things like that. In 2001, I went completely off on my own, and I did a book called Raider, which was an action-adventure spy book that you've never heard of because it didn't do very well, but that's where I made all my mistakes. And then I tried out for a contest for a show called Situation Comedy. It was kind of like Project Greenlight for sitcoms, and I wrote a script called Long Distance, but that and the last volume of Raider is what gave me the bug for writing banter and romance. And then I released Love and Capes the next year, and things took off from there.
So Love and Capes is an interesting series because it's sort of, I guess, looking at a Lois Lane-Superman relationship, but putting more of a focus on the romantic angle rather than, you know, fighting Lex Luthor. So when you're putting a series like that together, how are you kind of taking those steps to get the story on the page, and how do you know when you're kind of getting everything right?
I created a bunch of rules for starting the book. Like, I didn't want to show the fights. I wanted it to be about the relationship. I wanted to make sure both characters were represented in the relationship. Because doing a superhero book, it's really easy to focus on the superhero and not the civilian. Some of it came about because I didn't like when Superman got married in the comics that he got engaged and 6 months later he told Lois he was Superman, because it seems to me you should lead with that if you're going to get engaged to somebody. And I think there were like production reasons why they did it, but I thought it was really interesting to tell a story about when you decide to open up and bring somebody in. And past that, it was just really based on sitcoms. It was based on classic comics. It's actually got a 4-panel grid. Well, it's an 8-panel grid, but every 4th panel is a beat or a joke. So it's aping Bloom County and Calvin and Hobbes, and it becomes like a comedic metronome to make sure that I keep putting funny stuff in there. And past that, it's got that very sitcom vibe of characters have jobs, and you see them at their jobs, but you very rarely see them doing their job. Like Ross was a paleontologist on Friends, but you never really saw him paleontologize. It was them hanging out in the coffee shop or occasionally before and after work.
When you're putting together a story that is more of a romantic sitcom kind of script, how as a visual storyteller are you approaching that? I'm assuming it would be different than regular superheroic comics where they're looking for more of the action. You're looking perhaps more for the emotion. So how are you approaching that as an artist?
It's a lot of expression. It's a lot of body language. I read a book. There's a 2-book set called Drawn to Life. It's Walt Stanchfield's Disney lectures. And they're the first books since art school that I felt were written at, they were the first books I found that were written at that kind of professional level. Like, all the drawing books I had read were kind of how to draw comics the Marvel way, which is awesome, but after you go to art school, you need something more, and Walt's books were the ones that really, I can tell you what page of what book I was working on because all the figures get better and the poses get better, and it's that kind of storytelling. And then trying to figure out how, like, I love dialogue, but it's hard to write those many words in comics and not have it just be too clunky. So it's paring things down and trying to get that comedic timing down. And those are the things that you're playing with more than action adventure stuff, which I don't mind drawing fight scenes, but I like trying to make the quiet moments interesting more than trying to make the loud moments interesting. There's
been a lot of discussion lately about how many words you should put into a balloon, how many words there should be on a page. So when you're writing something that is more dialogue-driven, maybe that sort of screwball comedy style dialogue, and you've got to pare it down, at what point do you know that you're cutting to the bone and not cutting through the bone and making sure that the joke still has legs, but, you know, isn't too wordy and confusing to the audience?
The advantage I have is that I write and draw it, and I'm enough of a jerk to myself where I will redraw or change a panel if it's not working. So, like, there aren't any hard rules about how to do it, but I know when something's going to be dialogue heavy and I leave more space for it. And just the comedic timing is important, and that's telling you where you can have words and where you can't, and those become like guardrails as much as anything else because you have to serve the story. And you're also, because I've accepted this 4-panel grid format, that's telling me when I can spread out a joke or when I have to compact it. Sometimes I'll have a joke and there's too much in the one joke and I expand it out to 2 jokes, 2 beats, or the other way around. And yeah, it's hard to do, but it's just figuring out which one works best and always trying to keep the story in mind.
And it seems like that's a great deal of discipline because making sure that you're hitting the beats just right, making sure that the joke is in the spot that you want, seems like there's a lot of planning going on. And you had mentioned that you had created some rules going into that series. So I'm wondering, is that something sort of like a series Bible on a sitcom where we know all about the characters and we know what they will and won't do, and from there you can kind of tell their story? Or is it something where it's just, you're kind of winging it at a certain point because you know the characters internally?
Oh, I'm totally winging it. I'm making a lot of stuff up. It's just general guidelines for how I want to tell the story. And every time I do a project, I try to figure out something different to play with in terms of storytelling. So there have been books that I've done that play with color differently, or actually color is a thing that I've used a lot in my books, but trying to find some part of storytelling to focus on that's a little bit different. So with Love and Capes, the general rules were you're not going to see any superhero action. You see them before and after. I wasn't going to introduce too many superheroes. Like, I had a rule that it was 1 new character per issue because I didn't want to weigh too heavily on the superhero stuff because that was tempting. Like, I can write superhero jokes all day, but if it's about 2 people in a relationship, you have to write about 2 people. It's why I made Abby a bookstore owner and Mark's an accountant, because I figured, well, I like books and I have to do my taxes, so I can write enough jokes based on that to keep the real stuff real.
After a while, you're working on your creator-owned stuff, but then you end up doing some work for My Little Pony. So I'm wondering how you kind of go from something that's geared more towards a grown-up audience versus something that's, I guess, more of an all-ages book.
I did Love and Capes for Free Comic Book Day for a few years, and that had to be all ages. And I know people argue about the term, but to me, all ages should be like Star Wars. I read Star Wars saw Star Wars when I was 7, and it was great. I saw it when I was 27, and it worked differently, and it was still great. And it's hard to do that. It is not an easy thing to achieve, but I think you can write stuff that is appropriate for children that they can be interested in without going too far and excluding them from it. So there was some of that with My Little Pony. It's also, when you work on a licensed property, you have to put all the toys back where you found them because they're not your characters. So I guess maybe having those kind of guidelines that I had for Love and Capes made it easier to transition to doing something where I couldn't do everything that I might necessarily want because I was limited by what My Little Pony would allow. And to be honest, they're Hasbro's incredibly giving on that. It's not a difficult thing to do, but it just gives you some vague idea of where the road is going. And coming from relationship comics, you're telling a story differently. It doesn't feel like you have to fall back on a lot of the superhero, like external drama, characters being in conflict. The My Little Pony characters are actually incredibly well designed from a storytelling point of view, that any 2 characters have a reason to like each other and they have a reason to hate each other. So you can always find some sort of drama in there. And like the first season of Next Gen, where everybody got along and it was boring. So having to write relationships is the thing that made it easier for me to write My Little Pony.
And when you're working on My Little Pony, from a visual storytelling standpoint, is this markedly different than Love and Capes, or is this, it's the same basics and therefore the technique and approach will be the same?
The technique and the approach is basically the same. I probably on the first issue I drew, because I drew 1 issue completely and I mostly do covers now, I probably tried a little too much comic book stuff in that first issue. I was not a My Little Pony fan when I got the job. I approached IDW because I knew they were going to do a bunch of covers and I wanted to be part of it because they didn't have a lot of people who were doing really cartoony stuff, and Love and Capes was cartoony, so there was enough of a connection there. And when I got put on the book and was pitching on it, I had to read and catch up, but I didn't realize everything. There are things like I thought the ponies were younger characters than they were, where their ages are not completely known. So it started throwing off like how tall I was drawing characters, because I thought there were supposed to be younger characters, little things like that. And then as far as marketing, Love and Capes, I was marketed on my own. My Little Pony, I could let Hasbro and IDW do that. I mean, the book was doing well enough where, their marketing was already in place. With Love and Capes, I was always going to the places where people weren't, or where they weren't being taken care of. It's part of the reason I didn't do a straight superhero book, because if you want to read awesome superhero stuff, DC and Marvel do like a bazillion comics a month, but very few of them have characters in healthy relationships, and that was different. So I could aim for that audience that wasn't being taken care of.
And when you're working on a book like My Little Pony, which has a huge audience, how does that open doors for you for other projects that you're doing? How does that get more readers for the projects that you've done in the past?
So a thing like My Little Pony has a huge fan base, and they start seeking out the people who work on it and finding what they do. So it was definitely a whole new world of people finding me that way. And also it changed how I did comic book conventions. I was doing a number of them before. I probably do too many, but I started being more of a featured guest because I was working on such a, above the fold property that people knew. As Love and Capes always had a following, but My Little Pony has a huge following. So that allowed me to get into places that I wasn't before and promote and talk about what I do. And when you're at a convention and selling yourself, if you're interesting / entertaining enough, people will start to look at the other things that you do if they find that they have a connection with you.
And one of the things, we met at a convention, we met at Heroes Con this past June, and you get to meet a great cross-section of people. So someone like me, I just came across and I thought it was interesting work. So when you're meeting people, how do you kind of balance that, I'm at the convention to basically move some product, but at the same time I'm trying to engage people who are just genuinely curious. How do you balance your time?
I think a lot of it's like dating. Like, you don't want to be desperate. I have my elevator pitch for everything. I generally ask people if they've seen the book, and then it's figuring out what level they want to engage with you at. But I think, so among my many theories on that, I think that you need to do it for pure reasons. Like, I want a sale to take place, but I don't want it to be all about the sale, because if you come by and we talk and I don't make a sale, then I'm disappointed. But if what I'm there to do is more talk and a sale happens, then it brings the energy up. So while I'm capable of having an incredibly tactical conversation and knowing where I'm trying to lead things, if it's a 6-year-old who's coming up who just loves My Little Pony, I want to spend as much time with that person just because they're a fan of My Little Pony, and they may not meet another comic book artist, or you don't know what level you're working at with those with people who are coming up. And especially My Little Pony has an incredibly huge fan base of autistic and people around the spectrum. And when you start dealing with that, there was one time I was talking to somebody and it was getting to that point where you're like, oh, I might have to ask this person to leave. I don't think they're getting it. They're not picking up the cues. And I was good about it, and the person left, and then their mother came up and said, my son doesn't talk, but he was talking to you. And that helps keep a cap on, for as much as I do want to sell books and move product, that there is also a different purpose that's being served by you being there.
That's something that I guess most of us aren't considering, because when you talk to the fan like that and you touch them in a spot that no one else really is, that's got to be very empowering as a creator.
Oh yeah, it's the connections you make with people are the best part. It's why I love doing conventions, because so much of my life is in an 8x20 room off my kitchen, just me and the cats.
So I did have a question, because you're doing a lot of work with Webtoon now. So I was wondering how you went from print to the digital realm.
They asked. I was at Baltimore Comic-Con and was at a party and got introduced to Tom Akel, who was the editor-in-chief at the time. And we hit it off. He came by my booth the next day. I started telling him about one of the other books I did called Long Distance, and he bought it midway through the pitch, which I've never had happen. And I didn't want to sell past the close, but there was a lot of nobody's ever done this before. I don't know what to do. But being a romance writer in Webtoon is like being a left-handed reliever. So in comic books, romance stuff isn't taken all that seriously anymore. I mean, comics are not any one thing, but it's not like when there were regular romance books being published by DC and Marvel. It is more of a niche market. But when you go into webtoons, it's what they're looking for. And Thom recognized that. And once I got in, I recognized it. It's a slightly different storytelling process because you're working with the infinite vertical scroll when you're on your phone. And you lose vistas because your phone is this and you can't do this anymore, which works okay for romance, dialogue heavy conversation books. But that's always a challenge that I'm working with. But I didn't know what to expect. I came in with something quote unquote safe. Like I had a project that I figured out if it went badly, how it could finish up on my own, or it was always designed so it could double as a print book, where the new thing I do, Cupid's Arrows, is trying to take much more advantage of the format that I wasn't able to take care of, or that I wasn't able to approach the same way in a Warning Label.
It's interesting because it is a new way to look at comics. I mean, yes, there are readers for the tablet, but Webtoon is interesting because it does make you do the scroll rather than the page turn. And I've spoken to a few creators who have used, the gap between panels, that white space, as a storytelling device. So I'm wondering, as you've been working in this environment, how has that caused you to approach a story differently, or given you a new way to maybe visualize something?
I had really good teachers at Qbert. Mike Chen, he gave us entire lessons that were just doing lettering and playing with panel space and fonts, and it was all hand lettering at the time. But there was one lesson where you had to tell a story using just black or white panels and dialogue. And because of that, I don't know, when I get a thing like Webtoon, I start trying to take it apart and figuring out what stuff works, what stuff doesn't, and what I get to play with. The big place I've been able to do is you can run the dialogue into the white space in a way that you can't always do in a print book. So I've gotten a little less precious about how to lay a panel out so the lettering fits in it, because I can move the lettering other places. And I've tried to, there are times where I do a very long panel because I want to build that in as a timing thing, where like on Warning Label, they were essentially all square panels. And then there's a scene where two characters break up, and that is a long panel because I want that pause built in where you have to really linger on this moment. It's not all that different than doing it in a print comic where you're changing the size of the page, but it's the same approach. It's just different in Webtoon because your paper is infinite. You don't have to worry about hitting a page count. You don't have to worry about, you can go one panel over if you want from your original count. When I did Warning Label, it was designed to be 28 chapters. It wound up being 39 by the time it was done. It did well enough that Webtoons gave me that freedom to keep going with it. And that's something that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to do in print. So the infinite canvas changes, frees you up for some storytelling, but I think you still need to be a little precious about that, because you don't want to become indulgent. You want to know when you have to cut stuff or when you have to expand stuff.
It's interesting. You talk about that long panel as a timing mechanism. I'm imagining that's sort of a blend between a video, television series, and comics, because it does involve that moving screen. And it just seems like that's an interesting way to change, I guess, the experience for traditional comics as well, because at some point we're not going to want to read, I mean I will, but we're not going to want to go out and pick up an individual issue of a comic when we could just kind of scroll through and have our own experience that way.
Yeah, and I think the medium is always going to be in multiple formats. I don't think one is going to eliminate another. I think that it may change the popularity, but like TV shows that make movies go away. But it changed how movies were, and now theatrical movies tend to be a little more spectacular, or they tend to be a little more quiet. Things that you can't do on TV, or things that you can't afford to do on TV, really simplistically. So I think monthly comics will survive, because like on Webtoons, everything is essentially 5 to 6 pages of a comic, and that's a much shorter gap. You're telling chapters in a different way. It's not a 24-page block. It's a 6-page block that changes how you tell the story. And I think that's just something where there's always going to be an avenue for you to tell the story the way you want. It's just your audience numbers and how you do it are going to change.
So let's talk a little bit about Cupid's Arrows, because Arrow, pardon me, that's a series that you're still working on that now?
Yes, we're coming back to it real soon. We just finalized the contracts, and I'm working on season 2 right now.
So this is a multi-layered romance. You have these two Cupids who are they've got a job to do, but at the same time they seem to be attracted to themselves. So it seems that you're able to take the romantic comedy angle to different subgenres, whether it's mythology or superheroic. So what is it about that romance that's making you feel like you can just put any piece in there and have a fun story?
The romance stories that are always interesting to me are the long-term ones, because will they or won't they? When they do, you lose energy unless you really know how to pivot from it. The TV show Castle, I thought, actually did a really good job with it, because they knew that at some point the characters were going to get together. There were problems with the actors, but with the show, they managed to make it just as interesting even after they got together. With Cupid's Arrows, I want to do a long-term relationship between these characters. I like that kind of charm that characters have when they've been around for a while. I'm a big Star Trek fan, and I like how Kirk, Spock, and McCoy have been together for long enough where there is an internal rhythm and just this effortless charm the way they interact. And I wanted to have that in Cupid's Arrows. But the thing I learned from Warning Label is that Warning Label had a definite ending, and I couldn't keep emotionally abusing the main character. It had to end at some point. Cupid's Arrows was very much designed to keep going. So while there is a definite arc for what I intend to do, there's no point where if I get another idea, I can't do more. So having them get characters together allowed me to tell lots of tiny stories, kind of, because I keep referencing film, like Love Actually, where it's lots of little stories, and it's the sugar, cotton candy, mainlining important part of the relationship. And then I can use Rick and Laura, and I can tell different aspects of relationships on their canvas, and then they're bouncing in and out of stories. So it lets me do both, which is important to be able to keep the story going.
And it's interesting because you say that Warning Labels has a definite ending that you knew about when you were putting that together, and this other series is designed to be open-ended, but with an overall arc. So when you're creating this, are you kind of planning out the beats? Like, I know that we can get through this many stories, and then we have to start thinking about the ending, or is it something where this is the story, and I'm just going to get to the ending, and if it's a few more chapters over, it's a few more chapters over or under?
The best example I can think of for it is actually how I did Love and Capes, where I knew I was going to do 6 issues. That was like my season, and I said the first series is going to be them dating, then it's going to be them being engaged, then it's going to be them having a kid, which I later split into 2 volumes, and then it was the newlywed year and the year of having the kid. So I have an idea what the general arc of any season is going to be and how I have to build that long-term story. And then I will figure out for Cupid's Arrows each individual relationship that they get into. So in season 1, it's the couple at the coffee shop. That's their first one. There's a couple at a wedding. There's a couple at a comic book convention. I apparently hate myself because I keep writing crowd scenes. Those take a long time to draw. But so it's breaking down in each individual one, figuring out what has to happen in the story. I always need to know where my beginning and ending is, either for a chapter or a season. But I don't like knowing exactly how to get there, because if I do that, then it's harder to hold the interest. If I had all 28 chapters plotted out, it would just be me drawing and not writing it. Like, it wouldn't be storytelling. It is storytelling, but I wouldn't have as much creative control. There are decisions I made on the fly with both books, and there are decisions I made on the fly with, I think, everything I've done, where once you're in the middle of it, you see a better way through, but you're still aiming at the same target.
So it's interesting because it seems like you want to maintain that spontaneity while still having enough of an armature that you're working on, so that way you know that it's going to end up somehow close to the way you envision it, but it's not just going to be you going through the motion, and it keeps you engaged. So you might have something that you plotted out in January that you're still working on in August, and you're still engaged because you still have the ability to go in and kind of tweak it here and there.
Yeah, exactly. And you find like characters start becoming real in different ways and going in different directions. In Love and Capes, there are characters that got together that you can find interviews where I said they'd never get together, and it just kind of happened. Or characters that take off, like Amazonia in Love and Capes was only designed to be in the first issue. She wasn't supposed to be a regular character, and I couldn't do that book without her now, because once you get into it, like, there's no part in that arc of this is their dating year and it ends with him making a ring that Amazonia had to be in it. There's just stuff had to happen in 6 issues. So once I found that she was a comedic touchstone, I could start bringing her in a lot more. That was a decision made on the ground.
So I see we have about 3 minutes or so left in our conversation. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on your art. I was wondering if you are working completely digital, or if you're doing some work on the board and kind of scanning it to get it online, or how you're doing it.
Mostly I'm completely digital now. I'm either working on my Cintiq or my iPad. I do make sure that I do original art for covers because I can sell those. And I never want to be unable to draw traditionally. So much of doing conventions is doing commissions, and the computer's just another tool. It makes me faster. I can draw, because I've come back to Love and Capes, and I can draw a Love and Capes page 4 times faster than I could before. So that's amazing to me, and it makes me more productive. But yeah, it's mostly digital, but I want to make sure that I never lose the traditional.
And in about the 30 seconds that we have left, I was wondering if you could tell the audience how they could find out more about you.
Oh, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Thom Zahler, THOMZAHLER, and I'm THOMZ.com. That's my main website. And apparently, if there's a comic book convention, I'll be at it.
Well, Thom, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with me. Thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.